Adolf Hitler had spent nearly a year in prison, and it wasn't anywhere near as bad as he had imagined, considering that he was thinking of killing himself rather than going in. In fact, it had given him much needed time to think and refine his worldview. Most importantly, it allowed him to work on his book, one of the most controversial works in history, Mein Kampf. This book would eventually make him a multi-millionaire. Hitler had been released extremely early, serving nowhere near his 5-year sentence, and when he was out, he didn't really know what to do with himself. He had trouble reintegrating with society, and just sort of sat in his room with his dog for a while, barely seeing anyone. Eventually, however, he began to get out of his shell, and he began his work of rebuilding the party, as during his time in prison, it had essentially splintered into little pieces due to infighting. Before we begin, this video is part of a larger series, but can just as easily be viewed on its own to cover this period of Hitler's life. If you want to start from the beginning, however, the playlist is in the description and also on my channel homepage. Also, a disclaimer, I am discussing Adolf Hitler, who obviously is the most controversial man in history. I will express no views of my own in this video, and I am simply recounting events. All quotes are quotes of others at the time, and at no point will I say I endorse their views. Please use common sense. A special thank you to my patrons who make these videos possible. If you do enjoy these videos and want to join our Discord, our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or simply want to support the channel, please consider clicking the link in the description to sign up for as little as $2 a month. Any amount helps dramatically. Thank you. Adolf Hitler was invited to spend his first New Year's Eve out of prison at the Hoffman's house, his photographer. He kept refusing, but during the party, the girls there kept urging Hoffman to call and try again, as they all wanted to see the Führer so badly as they had never met him before. To Hoffman's surprise, the reclusive Hitler said yes and came out of his cave. He was eagerly awaited by the ladies, and he didn't disappoint. Supposedly, many were entranced by his little moustache. One even managed to get Hitler under the mistletoe and kiss him. Hoffman said, "I shall never forget the look of astonishment and horror on Hitler's face. The wicked siren, too, felt that she had committed a faux pas, and an uncomfortable silence reigned. Bewildered and helpless as a child, Hitler stood there, biting his lip in an effort to master his anger. The atmosphere, which after his arrival had shown a tendency to become more formal, now became almost glacial. Hitler almost immediately said an awkward farewell and got out of there. Ever since his release from Landsberg prison, Hitler was living like he had prior to his homelessness in Vienna. He would simply sit in solitude with his dog at home and was having a hard time readjusting to the new political climate as well as fitting into society. This worked in his favour in a way, as all his adoring followers were waiting for him to make his first speech. He didn't speak for a while, however, and took his time to catch up on how things had changed whilst he was away. The belligerent French regime, which had occupied the Ruhr, was replaced with a more conciliatory one, and the insane economic crisis had stabilised. The day Hitler set off the putsch, he paid 3 trillion marks for free beers. Now, things were nowhere near as bad. On the one hand, this wasn't good for Hitler, as it robbed him of his base of supporters, who were now less radical. On the other hand, the more stable environment offered Hitler a chance to spread his message nationwide and calculate his moves. The middle class had been totally upended and were looking for a hero. The margin of influence, which had kept these people above the working classes, had been annihilated with the inflation crisis, and whilst they were stable and not starving now, they quite rightfully felt hard done by and betrayed by their country. Many chose to blame the communists and the Jews. Who these people would turn to politically now should be obvious. Hitler vowed to play by the book now that he was out of prison, and to prove this, on the 4th of January 1925, he met with the Minister-President of Bavaria, Heinrich Held. He pledged his loyalty to him and offered to cooperate against the ever-present communist threat. The president supposedly said later that evening, "The wild beast is checked. We can afford to loosen the chain." Hitler went about healing the infighting in the party, and when the restrictions were lifted on the NSDAP on the 16th of February, Hitler wrote a lengthy editorial on the first edition of his newspaper, the Völkische Beerbascher, that was back on the shelves. It was titled, "A New Beginning." He called for peace amongst all nationalist elements within the party and to stop squabbling over personal or religious differences. He said they must unite against the common enemy, Judaism and Marxism. The next day, Hitler made his long-awaited return to public life at the Burger Braukeller, the beer hall where he launched the putsch. The speech was set for 8 p.m, but by mid-afternoon the lines were already forming up outside. By 6 p.m, the doors closed, and inside were waiting 4,000 people. Another 1,000 had been turned away outside. National Socialists from all over the country had appeared to see their hero again. Röhm, Strasser, and Rosenberg were three important men who were not present, however. Rosenberg had felt slighted, as Hitler had had almost nothing to do with him lately, and he was too proud to turn up and shake hands with Hitler, the man he felt had forsaken him. As Hitler appeared and marched down the aisle, the crowd went wild and waved beer mugs, cheered, hugged, and kissed each other. When he began to speak, it was the new Hitler talking. He called for total loyalty and to cease infighting. He called Ludendorff the most loyal and selfless friend, despite this obviously not being the case, and urged all those who, quote, in their hearts remained old National Socialists, to band together behind the swastika and tackle their main two enemies. He said something to appeal to all elements of the party, from the socialists to the racists, to the revolutionaries to the conservatives. He made an inspirational appeal to everyone, saying, quote, it is madness to believe that a great people of 60 or 70 million cannot be destroyed. It perishes as soon as it loses its drive for self-preservation, end quote. He said to those in the crowd to blindly follow him on his crusade. If anyone comes and puts conditions on me, he said, my friend, wait and see what conditions I will put on you. I am not out to get the great masses. After a year, you can judge, my party comrades, if I have acted correctly. Then I will place my office back in your hands. Until that moment, however, I alone lead the movement, and no one makes conditions for me, so long as I personally assume all responsibility. And I unconditionally assume responsibility for everything that happens in the movement, end quote. The crowd went crazy, and hiles rang out seemingly forever, as women in the audience cried with joy, and men who had been bitter enemies surged onto the platform and shook hands. The message was crystal clear: unity within the party above all. Hitler left Munich, exhausted, and took some time to recuperate in the countryside at the Wagner family home. The very next day, though, a dramatic change occurred on the national stage. Following the national elections brought about by the death of Ebert, Germany's biggest Great War hero, Field Marshal von Hindenburg, became the president of the Republic. Whilst on the surface, either attempting to, or pretending to, remain politically neutral, Hindenburg was nothing of the sort. His sympathies clearly did not lie with the Republic, and he was a monarchist through and through, a man of the right. His time in office began almost immediately with endless cabinet crises over things as trivial as the colours of the German flag, or whether a financial indemnity should be awarded to the dethroned German royal family. Back with Hitler, however, things weren't going well. His stunning speech of unity had quickly backfired on him, and the Bavarian government cracked down once again. He was gaining power too fast and too excessively. 5 mass meetings set for early March were now banned on the grounds that Hitler was inflaming tensions. One example was when he said, quote, fight Marxism and Judaism, not according to middle-class standards, but over corpses, end quote, in his return speech. Hitler was absolutely furious and went to protest in person. Those who want to have a fight with us can have one, he said to the police officials. Whoever attacks us will be stabbed from all sides. I will successfully lead the German people in their fight for freedom, if not peacefully, then with force. This sentence I repeat emphatically for the benefit of the police spies, so that no erroneous reports will be circulated, end quote. This probably wasn't the smartest choice of words for a man on parole, and he was immediately slapped with a public speaking ban throughout Bavaria. Public NSDAP meetings could be held, but not if Hitler spoke. Soon, these rules were followed up in almost all German states. The walls were closing in on Hitler yet again. The restrictions forced Hitler to take a new approach, and he began tirelessly rushing between one closed meeting to another in Munich, and personally speaking to smaller, more upper-class groups behind closed doors. Others, like Streicher, were busy out rallying the local organizations behind the Führer, on behalf of the Führer, given that he couldn't do so himself. By the end of March 1925, Hitler had Bavaria in the bag, and his control was total. He was too focused on one location, however, and he turned over the fate of the party in North Germany to Gregor and Otto Strasser. Gregor was a good organizer and speaker, and a delegate in the Reichstag. He had recently pledged his allegiance to Hitler after the Burger Braukeller comeback speech, But Otto had his reservations about Hitler, and he was a tricky journalist type. Hitler took advantage of the ban from public life, much like he had done with his imprisonment. He took his time to mend broken friendships and attend more and more meetings behind closed doors. He reinstated Rosenberg as the editor of the Volkische Beobachter and called him a most valuable collaborator. Next, he set about solving a looming threat that often sat above his head: deportation to Austria. He tackled the problem head-on, and for a fee of 7.5 shillings, Hitler paid the provincial government of Upper Austria a termination fee, and he was officially freed from his allegiance to the Austrian state. He was not yet a German citizen, and couldn't officially hold office, but he couldn't be deported either, and was sure he could fix his citizenship problem another time. A far bigger issue than the citizenship one arose, however, which would truly never be solved until 9 years later. Ernst Röhm, the egocentric leader of the SA, had used the time whilst Hitler was in prison to strengthen his own hand. He had formed an organisation from the remnants of his stormtroops, and on the 16th of April he gave Hitler a memorandum stating that this could be the foundation of a national political organisation, but that it must be under Röhm's total authority. Hitler knew he couldn't be reliant on organisations outside of his control, and that one of the most important aspects of the NSDAP was that other groups had to be annexed by the party and be under Hitler's command, as to not dilute power. He told Röhm no, and demanded the organisation pledge their personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler. But Röhm wouldn't budge, and simply handed in his resignation. He asked Hitler to write a written acknowledgement of this, but none came. On the last day of April, he wrote to Hitler again, appealing to the difficult times they had been through together and their previous friendship. Röhm didn't get a reply again, and simply publicly resigned. Röhm's power play had failed, and he was left as a man without a party or an organisation. Röhm was absolutely furious and would complain bitterly about Hitler for months afterwards. In the spring of 1925, Adolf Hitler would acquire a brand new red Mercedes, in which he travelled the Bavarian countryside for hours and hours. He also acquired a brand new headquarters near the Austrian border in Berchtesgaden, which would soon become one of the most famous places in Europe. He loved the scenery and would wander around for hours wearing lederhosen. It was here that he finished writing the first volume of his book, Mein Kampf. Again, the biggest help with writing was Rudolf Hess, who was now out of prison and had been hired as the Führer's private secretary for 300 marks a month. Ernst Hamstegel, around this time, one of Adolf Hitler's closest confidants, was pushing him to visit the world. He said, "You cannot have a Weltanschauung, aka worldview, unless you have viewed the world." Hitler would simply reply, "What would happen to the movement if I did that?" As those up to date on the series know, Adolf Hitler never visited anywhere in his life up until this point, except where the Great War had taken him, and obviously the nation of his birth, Austria. Hamstegel even offered to teach him English so he could understand the British and American newspapers who were always talking about him and his movement, and so he could gain a broader understanding of the outside world. Whilst never directly refusing this offer, Hitler clearly never took him up on it. The attempts to open Hitler's eyes to new things didn't stop here either. Hamstegel's wife, Helene, even offered to teach him to learn to dance the waltz. Hitler refused, even when Helene reminded him that Washington, Napoleon, and Frederick the Great all knew how to dance. Adolf replied that it was, quote, "a stupid waste of time, and these Viennese waltzes are too effeminate for a man to dance. This craze is by no means the least factor in the decline of their empire. This is what I hate about Vienna," end quote. On the 18th of July, 1925, the first volume of Mein Kampf was published in Munich. By the end of 1925, the book had sold a little under 10,000 copies, which was good for the time. It was through this book that Hitler's views that he had developed further in prison were expressed to the world. Above all, his hatred of Jews were now written in black and white, along with his reasons for doing so, and a sort of recent history of their relationship with the German nation. At the end of the chapter, talking about his blindness during the Great War, he said, quote, "We cannot bargain with the Jews, only present them with a hard either-or. Therefore, I am now convinced that I am acting as the agent of our Creator by fighting off the Jews. I am doing the Lord's work," end quote. All over the nation, many were becoming radicalized by Hitler's words, finally finding someone to lay the blame on for their recent misfortunes. From the start, it had been an obvious mistake on Hitler's part to put Gregor Strasser in charge of the party in North Germany. He was a typical left-wing National Socialist, and whilst not on Hitler's level, he was an excellent speaker. He was making massive waves in the north of the nation and becoming a dangerous political rival to the Führer. Strasser's appeal to the working class was working. The struggle against the southern part of the NSDAP was becoming an open issue at a party conference in September. Strasser and his men hoped to pry Hitler away from his more right-leaning reactionary Bavarian advisors in order to bring about a more revolutionary working-class movement, but there was never any real hope of this. Hitler's idea was always to eliminate class struggle and become one people, the German people, and Strasser's working-class uprising approach was completely counter to what the party stood for at its core. Some of Strasser's policies were even bordering on National Bolshevism. One of the editors of one of Strasser's publications pumping these ideas out was a 29-year-old who had replaced Himmler as Strasser's secretary. His name was Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was born into a Rhenish Catholic family and was shaped by his time in university after the war. He was exempt from service in the Great War due to his clubfoot and small, skinny frame, but the soldiers who flocked to the university after the war instilled their ideas in him and made him the man he was now. He had had many left-wing ideas, but loathed the internationalism of Marxism, and in Hitler he found, quote, the incarnation of our faith and idea, and worshipped him immediately. At the same time, he had another idol, Strasser. The split loyalty was to cause a lot of trouble going forward and was going to play a major part in events. In a way, Goebbels was still a bit of a Marxist, and it was this that would help him convince and win over so many others with similar views to Marxism. One of his and Strasser's main aims was to champion the cause of the workers and trade unionism. On Hitler's next trip north, he hoped to influence Hitler on this point, as the Führer currently differed to him on it greatly. On November 4th, Goebbels finally met his hero. In typical emotional Goebbels style, he wrote in his diary that day that when they met, it was, quote, like an old friend, and that, those big blue eyes, like stars, he is glad to see me, I am in heaven. Goebbels would remain enchanted with the Führer forevermore from this day. They met again several weeks later, and this time he again wrote, great joy, he greets me like an old friend, and looks after me, how I love him. Within 24 hours, however, Goebbels was participating in an open revolt at a meeting of Northern Gauleiters, aka regional leaders or district leaders. He had been delegated to help Strasser write a new party program aimed at, quote, liberating the Führer from the reactionary Munich group and turning him to the left. This essentially communist program called for state ownership of all land, division of large agricultural estates among landless farmers, and nationalization of corporations. It was presented to the Gauleiters on the 24th to the 25th of January 1926, and the sessions were predictably stormy. According to Otto Strasser, all of the Gauleiters voted for the program except one, Robert Ley. Hitler's proxy at the meeting, Gottfried Feder, openly objected and said, quote, neither Hitler nor I will accept this program. He shouted out that confiscation of property was a, quote, Jewish swindle, and he was shouted down. Goebbels leaped to his feet and began furiously attacking Feder. Supposedly, he even shouted out the demand that Hitler should be expelled from the party unless he freed himself from the influence of those in Munich. This seems strange, given that days earlier he was saying he loved Hitler, but perhaps this was a result of the passion for Hitler, as he genuinely felt he was being led astray by those on the right of the party. When Hitler received Feder's reports of events, he was instantly roused to action and summoned all party leaders to Bamberg on February the 14th. It was extremely tense between the Northerners and the Southerners with their varying views, and things could easily have gone wrong. But the Führer stepped up and spoke, and immediately made it clear that he was the leader and the nucleus of the party. There was to be no parliamentary debates and no more democratic procedures in the NSDAP, he shouted. He would tolerate no more splinter groups. Each Gauleiter and each member was to pledge allegiance to the Führer and the Führer alone. He did not publicly mention Strasser or Goebbels, and he probably knew deep down that both were truly loyal to him. He had no ill intentions towards these men, he simply wanted them back in the fold. He said that everyone must remain loyal to the party's original ideas, otherwise it was essentially a betrayal of those who had died believing in the cause, such as on the morning of the Beer Hall Putsch. Goebbels and Strasser were stunned into silence by Hitler's brilliant speech, and essentially Goebbels swung more to Hitler's side. After Hitler's roaring success in Bamberg, speaking to the Gauleiters, he took to the road for financial support. On the last day of February, he spoke at Hamburg's Atlantic Hotel, as technically this wasn't a public rally. He abandoned his usual style, so familiar to all, of shouting, screaming, and emotion, and he played a different card for this more sophisticated crowd. He calmly explained how and why Germany had lost the war, and who he believed was to blame. He made no appeals to emotion or racism, but simply to logic, patriotism, property, and prosperity. Within an hour, he had completely won over the crowd. The next month, Hitler set about charming Goebbels and Strasser. Strasser capitulated and ordered a recall of all copies of his National Bolshevik-esque program he had sent out. As for Goebbels, a special trip in early April was made, and after a few days as Hitler's personal guest, Goebbels was again so taken by him that he had trouble sleeping. They discussed politics together, and Hitler calmly explained their differences, and point by point, Goebbels was totally won over. He left Munich in a state of ecstasy, writing in his diary, quote, "We ask, he gives brilliant replies. I love him. Social question, quite new perspectives. He has fought it all out. He sets my mind at rest on all points. He is a man in every way, in every respect. Such a firebrand. He can be my leader. I bow to the greater man, the political genius." End quote. By spring 1926, Adolf Hitler had complete and total control of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Munich was the hub of the entire movement, and after the capitulation of Strasser in the north, this was now an undeniable fact. Hitler's power was affirmed on the 22nd of May when he was invested with the power to select or dismiss any Gauleiter he wished. All democratic principles that existed in the first place in the party were now totally eradicated. The original 25 points of the party he and Drexler had written up on that late night all those years ago were now officially declared unalterable. The crisis was basically over. Whilst Goebbels kept up a facade of loyalty to Strasser, in reality he was completely loyal to Hitler. By the time of their next meeting, he was writing in a familiar vein in his diary again, quote, "Hitler is the same dear comrade. You cannot help liking him as a man. And on top of it, that overriding mind. You always discover something new in that self-willed head. As a speaker, he has developed a wonderful harmony of gesture, histrionics, and spoken word. The born whipper-upper. Together with him, you can conquer the world. Give him his head, and he will shake the corrupt republic to its foundations." His best epigram yesterday was, quote, "For our struggle, God gave us his abundant blessing. His most beautiful gift was the hate of our enemies, whom we too hate with all of our heart." End quote. In July 1926, Hitler spoke at the party congress in Weimar. The location was chosen because Thuringia was one of the few states where Hitler was still legally permitted to speak in public. Here, the split in the party was officially sealed, and Hitler's rule totally solidified. Goebbels described his speech as, quote, "deep and mystical, almost like the Gospels." And he goes on to say, "Shuddering, we pass together with him along the edge of life's abyss. Everything is being said. I thank Providence for having given us this man." End quote. Hitler walked off the stage to thunderous applause, which lasted for several minutes. Some in the party at this time were disappointed, as officially the party had less than 40,000 members. But Hitler did not mind this. It was one of the smallest parties in Germany, but it was his party, and he had complete control over it. He returned from the Congress to his mountain retreat to complete the second volume of Mein Kampf. Goebbels came to see him, and after his last day, again poured out his heart in his diary. "Farewell, my Ober-Salzburg," he said. "These days have signposted my road. A star shines, leading me from deep misery. I am his to the end. My last doubts have vanished. Germany will live. Heil Hitler." End quote. Hitler had finally fully gained perhaps his biggest supporter of all, who would remain forever loyal. Hitler saw the talent in him and sent Goebbels to run things in Berlin, where Strasser had his headquarters. Strasser's former private secretary was now his rival. The year ended with the party now having almost 50,000 members and growing steadily. The party was essentially a state within a state, as it had departments for foreign policy, labour, industry, agriculture, economy, interior, press, and even science. Further groups associated with the party were also either created or envisioned, such as the Hitler Youth and Leagues for Women and Teachers. By far, the most important arm of the party, however, was the SA. Hitler wrote to Franz Pfeffer von Salomon, the man presiding over the SA's build-up, quote, It should not be hidden and should march under a bright sky to destroy all myths that it is a, quote, secret organization. Thus, the fight against today's state will not take on the atmosphere of a society out for vengeance, but a great worldwide movement and war against Marxism, its structure and its wire pullers. We do not need 100 or 200 dedicated conspirators, but hundreds of thousands of fanatic fighters for our Weltanschauung. We must show the Marxists that the future boss of the streets is National Socialism, just as one day National Socialism will be the boss of the state." End quote. The official SA uniform was a brown shirt with a brown tie, which was actually purely accidental, as at the time a large consignment of brown shirts, originally intended for German troops in East Africa, were available at wholesale. The end of 1926 also brought about the publication of the second volume of Mein Kampf, and it was a history of the party from the day the 25 points were presented up until the Munich Putsch. The book clearly displayed many of Hitler's ideas he had been fleshing out for all to read. One included foreign policy. He completely wrote off France as being an enemy and rejected the idea that Germans must look back in anger and one day reclaim Alsace-Lorraine. He had no interest in the West, and all lands lost there, such as those also to Belgium and Denmark, were written off. He said, quote, "To secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled on this earth, we must take off where we broke off 600 years ago. We stop the endless German movement to the south and west and turn our gaze upward towards the land in the east." He spoke of his famous Lebensraum idea, which would later be used to explain his actions when he was actually in power. However, Hitler himself came out once he was in power and said he wished he had never written such things in the book and that he no longer held these views. "Thoughts run away with me when I write," he later said. "Of one thing I am sure. If I had known in 1924 that I would become Chancellor, I would not have written the book." End quote. Just after the publication, it was Christmas time, and he used the event to make another speech against his main enemy. He said, quote, "Christ was the greatest fighter in the battle against the world enemy, the Jews, and the work that Christ started but could not finish, I, Adolf Hitler, will conclude." End quote. On March the 5th, 1927, Hitler's greatest weapon was restored, his speech. The public speaking ban was lifted in Bavaria, and 4 nights later he returned to the stage. He spoke to a gigantic crowd at the Circus Krone. At 8:30 p.m, there was a shout of "Heil Hitler" from outside, and the band began to play. Hitler walked in wrapped in a trench coat, surrounded by his entourage as the crowd went wild. He began in classic Hitler style, slowly at first, reading the room before eventually erupting into his emotional shouting. A police reporter present said that Hitler fascinated the, quote, "spellbound, thousand-headed audience. When he is interrupted by applause, he extends his hands theatrically. The word no, which appears repeatedly in the latter part of the speech, is deliberately and theatrically emphasized." End quote. For 2.5 hours, Hitler talked non-stop of Germany's crisis and how the Jews alone were the only winners. During brutally long speeches like these, Hitler would drink as many as 20 bottles of mineral water, and his shirt would be absolutely soaked with sweat. When it was warm, he would keep a piece of ice on the podium, as to keep his hands cool. Immediately after every speech, he would take a bath. Hitler was clearly back in action, and his speeches were as explosive as ever. He definitely had not lost his touch over the years. Whilst Hitler was winning over the broad mass of society with his rousing speeches, he sent his new most faithful follower to win over the urban workers in Berlin. Goebbels set off north in a third-class railroad compartment with a worn satchel containing 2 suits, a few shirts, and some books. He arrived to find the party in Berlin in total disarray, and fights would often break out during discussions. Strasser and another man even ended up challenging each other to a duel at one point. Goebbels said, quote, "What went as the party in Berlin in those days in no way deserved that description. It was a widely mixed collection of a few hundred people with National Socialist ideas." End quote. The party on the streets was utterly outnumbered by communists and social democrats in Berlin. It seemed that Goebbels was faced with an impossible task in perhaps one of the most left-wing cities in the world at the time. The party headquarters was located in a filthy basement and, quote, "There was complete confusion. The finances were a mess. The Berlin Gau then possessed nothing but debts." End quote. Goebbels, however, was inspired rather than downtrodden by these events and strove to turn things around. He moved the headquarters to a better area, set up regular office hours, and established a sound accounting system. By February 1927, the party in Berlin owed nothing and owned almost 10,000 marks worth of office equipment, as well as a used car. He set about conquering the streets by both his speeches, which he was becoming increasingly proficient at, but also by physical combat. He made sure the SA sought out fights where the odds were in their favour, because according to Goebbels, quote, "He who can conquer the streets can also conquer the masses, and he who has conquered the masses has thereby conquered the state." End quote. When speaking, he would adopt a graphic and aggressive manner, and his landlady said he spent hours on end practicing in the mirror. All these years of practice would eventually lead to his rise to being one of the most important public faces of the movement. The party was clearly on the up, and things were improving all over the board. At every mass meeting since Hitler's ban was lifted, the size of the audience would increase. That was until Goebbels managed to provoke a ban of the party in Berlin. As he was speaking in front of a large audience, a heckler kept interrupting him, and eventually he could take no more and set the SA on him. The man was so badly beaten that he had to be taken to hospital. The newspapers said the man was a pastor in the Reformed Church, but in reality he was an alcoholic who lost his place in the church long ago and would go on to become an active member of the NSDAP later. After all this chaos in the press, the party was banned. The ban came at a terrible time, and it got worse as a ban was set on any National Socialist speeches in Prussia, by far the largest state in Germany. The annual party meeting at the Berger Bräukeller in Munich was dampened by an atmosphere of depressing realism after the events in Berlin. Hitler, however, ignored the setbacks in the north and continued on with his speeches to the men, discussing the usual topics, the Jews and the Reds. At the party day in Nuremberg later that year, it appeared as if all was fine, as 20,000 members appeared, 8,500 of them in uniform. The city was filled with pageantry and military airs. He spoke to them all of his Lebensraum concept and matched it up with anti-Semitism, claiming that the strong must rule the weak and that feeble democracy, internationalism, and pacifism were all creations of the Jews and should be swept aside by force. He wasn't so dramatic with the general public, however, and he genuinely did want to set about acquiring power by legal means. He spoke one-on-one with many everyday citizens on the streets, and thousands of hands kissed ensured the lifelong devotion of women, and many firm handshakes that of men to the party. He was learning to appeal to the basic needs of the average German. He no longer came off to most people as a nationalistic fanatic or a frightening revolutionary, but a reasonable man who only sought the welfare of the German people. Goebbels and Strasser were at each other's throats again that autumn, and according to Otto Strasser's account, Hitler appeared at his office, demanding an end to the quarrel, only for Otto to say, "Then tell it to Goebbels, he is the aggressor." The Strasser brothers were trying to play Hitler, and privately they had their reservations about him, calling him a fanatic, but one they could use. "Look, you know, as well as I do, that Hitler is no leader, but only a popular tribune of the people. We shouldn't let him throw us off, but must try to break him in and lead him in the right direction," said Gregor to his brother. The reply was that Hitler was no horse, but a tiger who, quote, "once he throws you off, he'll get rid of you for good," end quote. Gregor was having none of this. Essentially, Otto was dead set against the Führer and believed the brothers were playing with fire. Meanwhile, Gregor believed that Hitler was genuinely a good person who was being pulled in the wrong directions by fanatics in Bavaria, and believed that he could change him. By the end of 1927, Adolf Hitler had clearly demonstrated that he could handle people, both as individuals and as groups. It was clear he had a solution for almost any party squabble, and that his vision was long-term. He was building the framework, his state within a state, for the eventual victory. He did not know when it would come, or even how. It seemed so far off in these days, but he knew it would come. One thing that was missing, however, was a burning public issue to skyrocket the party to new heights and broaden the base to bring the final victory. The days of the inflation crisis were in the rear-view mirror, and whilst things were far from perfect, there wasn't one particular current burning issue to get voters to the polls. The burning issue wasn't far away, however, and it wouldn't even originate in Germany itself. It would come from Wall Street, all the way across the Atlantic, of all places. In early 1928, the ban against the party in Berlin was revoked, and Goebbels went on a massive campaign to win gains in the Reichstag in the coming elections. He did just this, and in the May 20th national elections, he himself was sent to the Reichstag. Hitler, however, obviously did not win yet, as the party elected only 11 other delegates. Over the past 2 years, the National Socialists had lost 100,000 voters and 2 seats. The fault didn't lie with anything in particular, and was most likely simply a result of the fairly stable economic situation at the time. Extremist parties do not win votes in times of even remote stability. There needed to be chaos. Talking about Versailles or the November criminals no longer worked. After the dramatic elections, Hitler returned to the Obersalzberg, where he now had a place of his own. It was a simple country house in Upper Bavarian mountain style. The first time he looked through the villa, he was completely captivated, and luckily for him, the owner was a widow of an industrialist and a party member. She rented it to him for 100 marks a month. As soon as he got the place, he got in touch with his sister. Quote, I immediately rang up my sister in Vienna with the news and begged her to be so good as to take over the part of mistress of the house. She duly did so, and brought her 2 daughters, Friedel and Angela Maria. The latter was usually called Geli. Geli was a 20-year-old girl, and she completely split opinions in Hitler's circles. Some, such as Hampfstegel, considered her, quote, an empty-headed little slut with the coarse bloom of a servant girl, without either brains or character. But others, such as Hoffmann, Hitler's photographer, considered her a, quote, lovely young woman who with her artless and carefree manner captivated everybody. The one who was most captivated by Hitler's niece, however, was Hitler himself. Many things have been written about the strange relationship between Adolf Hitler and Geli. Henriette, Hoffmann's daughter, said that Geli was the Führer's only true love. She said, if Geli wanted to go swimming, it was more important to Hitler than the most important conference. Picnic baskets were packed, and we drove to the lake. Many others said similar things along the same vein, and it's easy to see where they would get that idea, but it's also just as probable that he was a deeply caring uncle, and he took his niece under his wing in a family manner as well. Adolf Hitler is dead, so we shall never know for sure what he felt inside, but you can make your own mind up as the events between Adolf and Geli unfold over the next 2 episodes of the series. Hitler was incredibly overprotective of Geli. One day, records Ilse Hess, Geli sketched the costume she wanted to wear at the next Fasching Carnival and showed it to him. You might as well go naked if you want something like that, said Hitler, and immediately sketched a different, less revealing costume. She then got furiously angry and stormed out of the room, and after half an hour, Hitler had to go looking for her. By the end of 1928, Adolf Hitler had more than just Geli on his mind, however. He was worried that he could potentially have cancer. Cancer runs in the family, and after it had claimed his mother all those years ago, the fear that it would too reach him never truly went away. He sought help from a party member in Munich, Dr. Alfred Schwenninger, to, quote, allay his fear of cancer. The results were presumably negative, but his fear did not go away, and it would stay with him till the day he died, when he was terminally ill anyway from other illnesses. It had been a turbulent few years of ups and downs for Hitler and the party, and the years of 1924 to 28 would eventually go down as the wilderness years. The National Socialists winning at the polls was a political impossibility unless things became unstable or a major world or national event happened, and until that day there was no hope of success, and the only thing they could do was continue to build and prepare for such a time. Many lost faith, but Adolf Hitler never did, and he continued to build the framework, biding his time. As a result, he made the right decision, as the years to come were going to change everything. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video and you got this far, please leave a like on the video. Make sure to watch the other videos in the series to get up to speed also if you haven't already, and also follow me on Telegram. The link is in the description. Next time we will cover Hitler's time during the Wall Street crash and the crazy events it brought, as well as a major death in the family. A special thank you to my patrons who make these videos possible. Even the $2 tier helps, so if you do have a few spare dollars laying around each month, please consider subscribing and join our Discord or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or simply if you just want to support the channel. Thank you. Thank you to Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Lanza, Friendly Brian, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, and Chef Jeff.